You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and this is our continued conversation about John Carpenter's 1978 horror masterpiece, Halloween. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me today, Pete Charbonneau, also here with our returning guest, Joshua Pruett, Emmy-winning TV writer and author who's worked on Mystery Science Theater 3000, Phineas and Ferb, Last Comics on Earth. On our previous episode, we began our conversation about John Carpenter's Halloween and from the specific lens in discussing with Josh about his master's thesis. That's right, Josh wrote his thesis about the movie with his specific perspective as a writer, as a storyboarder, as a storyteller. We provided a little context to the movie, why it is as iconic, as legendary, as trailblazing as it was when it was originally released, and very shortly thereafter as it started to inspire other filmmakers to make a movie like Halloween, because one, it set us up for the slasher type template, that genre in horror, and also because for an independent film, it made a lot of money. With a reported budget of $325,000, the movie pulled in over $70 million in domestic and international box office. Became one of the most successful independent films up to the 90s, and I believe Blair Witch may have actually dethroned Halloween. So we're going to continue our conversation with Josh, get into themes, get into his paper, his perspective. It can certainly feel like a movie, an iconic movie, as Halloween has had everything said about it. Podcast, deep dive, YouTube videos that have gone into every piece of minutia about this movie. But I think you'll hear that specifically from Josh's perspective, there's something more to be said about this movie, because I think a lot of this stuff, again, comes from fans like Pete, like Josh, like myself, and how we first saw these movies. Also, how they continue to live on with us as we revisit these movies with a different perspective, with that fan perspective as well. So hopefully you enjoy this conversation, part 2, and let's keep it going.
Halloween, the motion picture about the most terrifying night of the year, starring Donald Pleasance.
I spent 8 years trying to reach him, and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up, because I realized that what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil.
Halloween, the night he came home. Rated R.
Now, when you were getting set to write your thesis, did you feel like pressure? Excitement? Do you remember like what you were feeling? Was it, did you feel a weight of like, I have to do this film justice for my thesis because I love it so much? Or, you know, how did you approach?
I thought I was getting away with murder because I was gonna write a paper about like one of my favorite horror movies. So then I got to go to the library and like look up books about horror movies, think about horror movies for, you know, the 3 months that it took me to write this thing. I was totally jazzed. And, you know, one of the things that I tried to do was, like I said, is be really careful about pretending that I knew what they were thinking. Like, I don't want to profess that. It was really important for me to just look at the frame, look at what the movie is delivering. And then, you know, certainly find articles where both Deborah and Dean and Carpenter were talking about what they had discussed. Because I think sometimes it's a slippery slope. I think that's one of the things, and for me, it was really an appreciative film paper. It wasn't, you know, film criticism. I feel like that's a slippery slope to go and assign intent. What's more interesting is like you're in an art gallery and you're just looking at what's in front of you. So that's how I tried to treat it. Okay, if I look at the elements, if I'm breaking down the elements, this is what the elements are telling me. They're calling him the shape. That's not a mistake. That's not a typo. So clearly that was intentional. I don't have to guess. So, but that was like the first, for me, that was like the first big stab, was being able to stand back and kind of evaluate it as a piece of art and go, oh man, look at that. That's crazy. That brushstroke is so great. What they're doing with the background. And then my emphasis for study was entertainment animation. So my emphasis was like in becoming a storyboard artist. So for me, it was like, oh yeah, like what are they doing with this frame? What can you do in the frame? And one of the things that they teach in art school when you are, working on your composition is that you are supposed to kind of take a step back from your comp and squint your eyes. And if your composition is still very clear, home run, you're more than halfway there. To be able to do that on a movie that I loved and stand back and be like, it's still super clear. I'm squinting my eyes and like, this stuff is still crazy. I can't believe that there's more layers to this thing that I already love.
The fact that we had a new tool at the time to kind of help us with that, the Steadicam. It was pretty ambitious because most of the time on low-budget shows, you didn't really spend a lot of time with the look.
I was going to say, speaking of that, did you feel any pressure because now you were defending your thesis in front of other people who had, a similar love for cinema, for horror movies, and maybe they didn't see what you did or didn't appreciate it as much as you did, but you're still now talking to people who can kind of speak the same language?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, I think mostly I was like, it's like my comment about horror being cinema's bastard. It's like most people aren't horror fans. So I think one of the things I've learned in the last 20 years, most people aren't necessarily as obsessed with movies as we are. They don't necessarily, there's so many more people who don't buy movies than there are people who do buy movies and want to take them home. And the group who love horror, it's even a smaller set of folks. Part of it is like, oh man, I'm going to have a tough time convincing anybody what I'm trying to talk about. So that's why I ended up having to I reread it recently, and I spent like the first 7, 8, 10 pages just trying to give some historical context, because my assumption was that maybe 2 or 3 people in that class, because it was other artists, would get what it is I'm talking about. But most of the other people, they would know Michael Myers' Mask, The Shapes of Mask, they would know the title, and they would probably know the music. But I figured that over half that class maybe hadn't even seen the first movie. So I felt like I had my work cut out for me a little bit. And, I ended up getting an A on the paper, which I was so thrilled about. But yeah, I was definitely worried about that, Bernie. I was super worried about like what my audience was going to expect. I think I was really wary initially. And I was like, man, they're not going to let me do this. But I felt pretty confident in the argument that I was making. I wasn't going to try to convince everybody that it was the greatest movie ever made, because I knew I would get pushback. Up until Blair Witch, and we have discussed this, it's like Halloween was the most successful independent horror film ever made until 1990. What was it, 99?
Yeah, which again, something that a lot of people like. You think Halloween, of course, it's a big budget movie. It's like, no, small movie, just over $300K. I think, the 20 days, and here's a few bucks, make a movie.
Exactly. And so I think at some point I decided, if I put my emphasis, I'm not talking about content, I was talking about form.
Since you read it, you said recently you kind of revisited. Is there anything in it that surprised you? You've got more miles on you. You've seen more movies. You see them from a different lens. Malcolm Gladwell, you've got your 10,000 hours in, Josh.
Right.
Revisiting it, I actually kind of surprised myself. Like, young Josh had some perspective.
The latter half of it I thought was actually better. The front half, where I'm spending a lot of energy kind of justifying that it's a good horror movie, that some of that writing was like embarrassing. I was like, oh, I can't. It's the thing that I would never do now. The education that I've given myself since then, 20 years ago. Oh yeah, I don't need to convince anybody that Buckaroo Banzai is a wonderful movie. It's just one of my favorites of all time. So it's like, I'm never gonna do that. But I wasted a lot of energy up front trying to give that context for why it was an important and influential horror film. In hindsight, that's the thing that I would have done less of. That's where some of the embarrassing writing was, where I'm making a lot of generalities and platitudes about horror. And I'm just like, oh, I don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Like, there's people who've been doing that for 40 years. And I don't want to apologize for horror. It's like, I wasted my energy and I had a college student's perspective. But the rest of it, the back end, where I actually got to do some analysis about what they were doing visually, like, that's the stuff that I was still like, oh man, I'm so glad that I took the time to kind of call those things out. And it was a great exercise. I think one of my favorite things about, like, I have fond memories in college of like turning all my friends on to Carpenter, because they would just make fun of me because I would listen to the music or I would just be talking about him too much. I sat all of them down and we watched The Thing. These were guys who had mostly watched cartoons their whole life. Subjecting them to that onslaught and them going, oh, holy crap, this is so great. those are some of my favorite memories. And then they would still make fun of me for listening to his music over and over again. But yeah, I was actually talking to my kids the other day. We were at the mall where I bought my first Carpenter soundtrack on CD. I think it's Dan Wyman doing playing all the themes, but it was like a best of. It was like a greatest hits. And so there are themes on that album that I knew the music before I saw the movie, but it was because of the score for Halloween, and that's why I picked it up.
I remember I'm about to walk across the street in the first shot, and I realize he has not told me anything about what I'm supposed to do as this character. So I came up to him and basically asked him, what's my motivation? As the shape walking across. How do you want me to walk? How do you want me to, am I supposed to be this or that? And he said, Nick, just walk.
Nick was suggesting all sorts of attributes that he could play to this character, thinking, okay, is he really a psychopath? Is he really crazy? Is he somebody who's insane? Does he have any of the kind of schizophrenic movements that we kind of associate with mental illness? And I just told him to be simple with it. Basically, when he's watching something or someone, stand still, just move very gracefully, because Nick can do that. Make this killer almost a blank slate that we can project everything into and make it much more horrifying.
Was there anything in your thesis at the time, or that you saw rereading it, especially that back end part that you're fond of, that you felt you left out, that you would have liked to have included, or that you had to cut for space or anything like that?
Yeah, it was a little shorter than I think I'd wanted it to be. For me, it was, I've got to cling to the things where I can find sources and evidence for. And, there was certainly critical analysis done at the time. There were, the good reviews came out kind of months later. It took time to build. And certainly in the years since, people have kind of written about the movie. But people hadn't really written about the abstraction and all of that in the way that I was thinking about. I wasn't innovating or anything, but it was like, that's what I would have loved to dig into more. But there wasn't a lot of evidence to support it. Those were harder sources to identify. People talking about the abstraction of the mask, there was plenty of context for that.
John assigned me the task of finding some choices for the Halloween mask. And I picked up two that looked like really good, legit choices. One was an Emmett Kelly mask. Emmett Kelly was a classic clown with a big red nose, stupid hair, and a big smile, big blue smile on his face. And I thought, how frightening, how grotesque.
The first Michael Myers mask was actually a William Shatner from Star Trek masks that we kind of changed a lot. We opened up the eye sockets, we changed the hair, we did something to the skin tones to make it this white, pasty kind of mask. And it was kind of scary because it was sort of featureless. And that's what we're going for.
And first it was the Emmett Kelly mask, and he came out of the bathroom wearing it, and everyone agreed it was pretty eerie. It was strange. It was weird. Made you uncomfortable, and you knew that was a scary situation. Went back, came out with the other mask, and a cold chill ran up everybody's spine. It was so scary looking. It was so demented. It was so sick that we knew we had it.
There's shots that he's not in, and they're just as scary as the ones that he is in. How the hell did they do that? And that, for me, is like the magic trick. And my favorite piece of evidence of that is literally those last 6 shots in the movie. So Loomis shoots him, walks to the patio, the top, on the second floor, looks down, does the second reaction that he gave Carpenter. He said, I can give him 2 ways. I can give you, I'm surprised he's gone. I'm going to look down at the body. Or I can give you, I knew this would happen. And, famously Pleasance had said, so Carpenter picked both. He was like, give it to me scripted, like you're surprised. Then go ahead and do the thing you want to do. So, of course, in the final, the one they use is that Loomis is not surprised, which is totally chilling. But then they do this thing where he looks up, and it's 6 locations where we've seen him with the breathing. and nothing's in the shot. There's nothing there at all. And like when I'm thinking about like horror movies and I'm thinking about like what they're supposed to do, they're supposed to be scary and they're supposed to be this and like there's a monster or there's a jump scare or there's like this is literally absence of the threat and it's totally scary and that's how they decide to end. So for me, that's when I went, oh, this is a whole other thing altogether. This is something else entirely. Like in some ways, I think it's closer to what Spielberg and like Verna Fields did on Jaws. They were motivated obviously in a different direction because, you know, the shark is not working. And so they had to use like the threat and the POV of the shark. But you're still dealing with the absence of the thing that is supposed to be scary and supposed to scare everybody. So like that's my favorite thing is kind of pointing to that last montage and being like, he's not there. He's not in that shot. He's not in that shot. And he's not in that shot either. In fact, these are all shots that they pulled from longer shots that they from earlier in the movie, and they reused them, and they added somebody breathing to the tension that movie stops on, where you're like, oh my God, he's still out there. So good.
The last shot of the film, looking down at the empty grass there, and then a little montage of all the places we've been. Evil never dies. You can't kill it.
There's something with that. I was recently at a dinner with one of my wife's former coworkers, and she grew up in Bowling Green.
No way.
And she was actually in the class that Carpenter's dad taught at Kentucky State or Bowling Green on classical music. Amazing. And she was sharing the story about he got like a call. He stepped out of the room, came back in, and he's like, hey guys, sorry, my son, who's the director, just called to let me know that he just married Adrienne Barbaro. And she's telling me this story, and her partner are both from that area. So she was like a contemporary to John Carpenter as far as age, growing up in that area. And she's like, when I saw that in the theater, every character name, all the streets, he was just they were naming things that I grew up with, that John Carpenter grew up with. But then just reminded me of like this story that I'd read where John Carpenter talked about how the cul-de-sac and like the idea of these spaghetti streets in some ways just creates like a turkey shoot for evil, because you're just letting a potential serial killer like Michael Myers literally go up and down a street and cause mayhem, but a mayhem in some ways of our own creation, because we've wanted to have that sense of community and like uniformity. And then I think of that, and then I think of like the two movies that you were talking about that, again, like kind of all of this kind of comes together. How Pete, like in the last year, you actually were able to see Assault on Precinct 13 and Suspiria for the first time. And I want to get back to that because I'm like, since Josh mentioned them both, knowing they were part of Carpenter's catalog and inspired him as well. Yeah, that cynicism of his that you see in Halloween, right? The police is inadequate, the failure of like the mental health system. In hindsight, we see it as a trope. Of course, Michael Myers escapes from the ambulance, but it's like, oh no, I think Carpenter early on is saying, hey, the cops, maybe they can't make it work. See Assault on Precinct 13. Government, maybe they're not going to make it work. See Escape from New York, They Live. Halloween, like maybe it doesn't matter that you set up all these streets next to each other. You probably just dug your own grave by doing that. I'm not a cynic. I'm just going to go chain smoke. That's John Carpenter.
Or I mean, or even that your neighbors aren't going to help you, right? I mean, like
absolutely.
I grew up, certainly in the 70s and the 80s where like, there would still be block parties and like, neighborhoods would like cordon off the street and everyone would have a barbecue and there's like this sense of community. And I know we certainly feel it now that we're a lot more isolated and like so many people talk. I've talked to so many friends, like I barely talk to my neighbors and this and that. But he kind of telegraphed that with this movie again, where Laurie's like going house to house. People are turning their lights off. I know there's themes of like stranger danger and stuff like that was starting to creep in with like Suburbia, but still feel like he was on the cusp of something there with the whole, like your neighbors aren't maybe you'll have a barbecue with them at some time, but when the shit hits the fan, they're like, they don't want to know, like, we're comfortable. We're going to go back to bed here. So there was even stuff there that I, obviously when I was younger, I didn't pick up on any of that, but
horror moving from outside to moving to your backyard.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That was a big deal. That was a big move.
He has no morality. You don't know where it's coming from. It's your deepest, darkest fear.
All right, last question for you, Josh. You mentioned your kids.
Yeah.
You've exposed them to some good TV shows and movies. Just see at Zombie TARDIS online and you will see the stuff that Josh watches. At one point, have you already exposed them to Halloween?
I haven't. So they've watched Escape 2 or 3 times. They've seen The Fog 2 or 3 times. And they've seen Night of the Living Dead. So Halloween and Jaws. So Halloween is kind of next.
You've seen and written a paper on Halloween. You know, the first time you watch it with them, I have to imagine it's through that lens. You're no longer watching the movie. You're watching the movie through them.
Oh, yeah, 100%. The entertainment value of watching those other movies with them. This one, I wanted to wait until they're at a certain age. I've been thinking about it a lot. And I thought we were going to get close this year. But I think next year is going to be the one.
Are you going to have them read the paper before or after?
Bernie, that's ridiculous. I'll be reading them the paper and giving a presentation.
Perfect transition, because Josh is about to get into his 6-hour read of his
thesis presentation.
Special bonus content.
So if you go to my Patreon...
Do you release 1 minute a month, I think? Is that how you're doing it?
1 minute a month for the rest of my life.
That's right.
Thanks for letting me share, gang.
I think the simplicity of the story and the way it was told is what made the movie really unique.
How many 20-year-old pictures do you have that keep their popularity? Halloween is the Gone with the Wind of the horror movies.